Hi, I'm Blue, the littlest volunteer at the Loyalist House Museum. This presentation, given by my good friends Steve and Peter, is on Fort Frederick and when the American Revolution came to the port of St. John. Please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any of our great speakers. Thank you.
Stone Church, and there's washrooms are right there. There's a sign in the back, right? And thanks for coming. So for next month, Troy probably mentioned this. We're going to try to have our own screen down on the floor, right? Because the screen is a little bit distant up there, right? So just a few reminders about most of you know the drill. I've seen it before. Historical Society, you have this house. We've got something on books for sale here on the right. We've got some merchandise. We have our famous donation box and a few things for sale that we don't know what's. I bet it was really heavy. Heavier when I take it back. So we have a few panels that oil says. Just a couple of announcements. We have for turning to Troy. We have a fundraiser on Tuesday night for David Goss Book Stories. So it's the first session is 7 o'clock to 8, and it's suitable for families with small children. We haven't sold a lot of tickets yet. David's volunteering his time. And then we have the second session with David for I wouldn't say totally scary, but slightly scarier stories, maybe not suitable for the small children, and that's from 8:15 to 9:30. So if we have a few spots left, and you start to yourself, you can send an email to the Loyalist House. Email address is on that pamphlet, or you can talk to David Troy. If anyone's interested in signing up, you can see us at the session today. And that will probably be our last fundraiser event that we do at the Loyalist House for the season, because we're going to close down house pretty soon for winter, right? So then we'll just be moving these talks. So if you're interested, or if you know anyone at all, we'll post it on Facebook. And there's probably 15 or 20 spots left for each of those first three sessions, right? So again, all money raised will be used to prepare for those. Okay, I'll turn things over to Troy. You can introduce the speaker.
Right. Well, thank you all for coming today. This is Blue, our littlest volunteer at the Loyalist House. You say hi, Blue. I'm just going to tag on to what Greg was saying about fundraisers. So we have a few things in mind for next year for fundraisers. So over and above what we normally doing. So we've got it on social media and stuff like that. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Peter and Steve here.
I'm Peter. He's Steve. We don't have it all. That's part of the script. You're going to say, you're Peter and I'm Steve. Oh. This is going to be taken.
Okay, we're just making it up. Thank you, Troy. And good afternoon, everyone. We're pleased to have you with us. Thanks for coming out. As Troy was saying, he is Peter, I'm Steve, and we are members of Delancey's community. So for the uninitiated, Delancey's is a wholly volunteer, nonprofit organization of historical reenactors. It existed here in the city of St. John for almost 45 years. I was in
45 years this last.
And we are, one more guest.
It's not a guest, that's your right.
Either way, we will pad the room. So we portray a Royal Provincial, or more commonly known these days as a Loyalist regiment, from the time of the American Revolution, so the 1770s and 1780s. The original Delanceys were raised in New York in 1776. These were American colonists who chose loyalty to their king over the rebellious cause of their neighbors, and so took up arms to fight alongside the British in their efforts to put down that rebellion. those who were still on the rolls of Delancey's by the end of the war, along with their families, were among the refugees who arrived here from out of the St. John River in 1783. And so that's our tie to the city. Additionally, I guess worth noting that our unit in particular was selected because our commander was Gabriel Ludlow, and Colonel Ludlow would actually eventually settle here and became the first mayor of the city. So that's sort of who we are. The story that we have to tell today. Oh, I'm sorry. We did the North Africa. He did the slides. I just copied.
So the Brunswick Historical Society and Delancey's Brigade respectfully acknowledge that our work in the province of New Brunswick and the event we are doing here today is carried out on the unsurrendered and unceded territory of the Wolastoq, Mi'kmaq, and Brigade of the Wolastoq Confederacy. We're certainly prevalent here in the time period we're talking about, and we're interestingly, some people we needed to contend with when we arrived as settlers in their land. So, as Steve said, this is a joint presentation by the Brunswick Historical Society and in an effort to be completely clear, both Steve and I are on the board of directors of the Brunswick Historical Society. Troy only asked us to do this, but we did not. So,
No, it was 2.5 weeks.
So, here we are.
We did a similar program last in August. So
We can talk about
so we built a little bit on that, but we have added a little more information because that was talking about our meeting.
It wasn't that we didn't know what we were going to be talking about.
Most will say we have never known what we're talking about. Okay, so to get to it, the story that we have to tell you today is about the early days of the American Revolution. And its first incursion into what was then Nova Scotia. That's the title. Specifically, we're talking about the raid on the St. John River and the burning of Fort Frederick that came about at that time. And that took place in the summer of 1775. My task is to give you a little bit of the background, some context, which will hopefully help you better appreciate both the significance and the setting of the events that took place. And then Peter will take over the story and talk about the actual events that took place. I do want to begin by telling you that these events did not involve the Delancey Brigade. In fact, our regiment wasn't raised until just about a year after this. But these events are very significant to what was going on back then that caused dozens of provincial regiments to be raised in the colonies and was likely very influential ultimately in why those refugees ended up here in 1783. So why are we telling the story? Well, to us it's very interesting, but we also understand that that probably doesn't mean much to most of the rest of the world outside of a room like this. So what's really important is that this is a St. John, New Brunswick story. These are events that took place literally within a couple of hundred yards of where we're at right now. And most importantly, these are significant events in our local history that very, very few of us know much about, if anything at all. If you grew up in New Brunswick or have spent much time here, you probably have some sense of who the Royalists were and a little bit of their history, but for most of us, certainly for me, when you're introduced to this, at one time it was in school, now not so much, but hopefully it's still making itself known. But that history really begins with the arrival of 14,000 or 15,000 refugees here in the summer and fall of 1783, and what transpired after. And it's not that that's not significant, but what most people don't know is that the American Revolution came to our shores long before that. In fact, it was just about 4 months exactly after the first shots of the American Revolution-related war were fired on the green at Lexington, events that we're talking about today transpired here, where the conflict actually came to the mouth of the St. John River. What would play out in the coming years were, as I said, almost certainly contributing factors to how and why those refugees ended up here 8 years later. So, why tell it now? So, if your math is good, it may have occurred to you that we were standing here in 2025 talking about the events of 1775. We are now in the early stages of the 250th anniversary of the American War of Independence. Lexington was recognized in April of this year. 19th of April was the 250th anniversary. And in fact, the events we're talking about, the burning of Fort Frederick, took place 250 years ago, this past August, 27th of August. And the photo you see up there is us. On the evening of that anniversary, we actually went to a site near where the fort had stood and did a commemorative ceremony. That's, for us, sort of the beginnings of what we want to do to recognize this. So that leads us to the why us. Again, our regiment wasn't involved. We were from New York. We're apart from this. However, as reenactors, the scope of our interest extends beyond the arrival of the Loyalists over the course of the entire war, and in fact some of the precipitating events that led up to it. And as we have been anticipating this 250th anniversary and looking forward to the various observances and events, reenactment activities that will take place, recognizing it, we also started to examine what was going on here 250 years ago, and delved into that and discovered some things that even we weren't entirely clear on. It turns out there's quite a lot going on. There weren't a lot of people here, but there were events that really mattered to the evolution of where we are today. We've got a friend over there, just in case you want to know. Sorry, I'm going to direct traffic here as I do this too.
Can't take the sergeant.
So for the past 6 months or so, we have engaged and started to tell the stories of what was happening here. And there is, we'll get to eventually, there is some purpose for us behind this. But mostly it's just because there are a variety of things going on that we think, or that were going on that we think are stories worth telling. And in fact, over the next couple of years, there are a series of stories that we're hoping to be able to share with the community to further explore the history of the Revolutionary War here, leading up to what we hope will be a more significant recognition in about 2 years' time of a more significant activity here. And so we're trying to say, explore this beyond our group, but into the community and help people understand this. This, ultimately, I guess, is simply a story that we feel is worth telling, as it is very much a story that affected what would come here. The city and the province were founded on the basis of all these people arriving, and these were the events that underlie that. So where did it all take place? We'll get to the crux. Again, sort of setting context. This is a painting done by a Royal Artillery officer. It's a somewhat romanticized painting, but it is an illustration of Fort Frederick that would have been done from Navy Island. This is a north facing, so you're in the harbor looking at it, and that gives you, if you know where Navy Island was, a sense of where this was.
Basically,
the very existence, let alone, the location of Fort Frederick is actually, again, one of those largely hidden aspects of our history that people don't tend to know about. And never mind the fact that it was only the latest of a whole series of fortifications that sat on that same site. We're all familiar with the location of Fort Howard, and we can certainly understand the strategic benefits of the towering vantage point approaching or regarding the approaches to the city and the harbor. But it would appear that in the 17th and early 18th century, the strategic focus was on defending the river mouth itself. And therefore, a whole series of fortifications, French and eventually English, were built at what would be the lower extremity of the lower west side, as we know today, at that time. So some of you will be familiar with Navy Island. Probably very few actually remember it as an island because it ceased to be one in the early 1960s. But John and I were discussing this on the way in. I hate sitting down and saying I would much rather have a room full of people who didn't know anything because then they won't know when I'm wrong. But I was already on guard as soon as people started coming in the door. So, in modern terms, if you are to drive along Chesley Drive now and look across at the Harbour Bridge, the very last pylon on the west side of the Harbour Bridge, before the edge of the water, sits on Navy Island. And you can actually still see the island. And I found this interesting as we started to do this work. I took a drive one day and was somewhat surprised myself. You can see the island because if you're on Chesley Drive and look out at the western approach of the bridge, you will discover that there is a natural shoreline out under that final pylon. But if you look back toward the earlier shoreline, you can tell that it's nothing but rock fill. It's a causeway, it's a filling. And that took place during the construction of the Harbour Bridge and wanted a solid pad to build on. So at that point, Navy Island ceased to be an island. The extreme point of land prior to that, the Navy sketch sort of reflects that. It's hard to position it. But that extreme point of land was essentially, as best we can tell, located just where the Harbour Bridge ramp starts. So it's common to think that a lot of people a few years ago, when you talked about it, thought that Fort Frederick sat about with the toll gates. When you look at the maps and positioning, you would go through the toll gates, and then you're still actually on flat ground, and just as you start to turn to the left and go up the ramp, the DMK Marine Wharf is right there on your left. And I very recently ran into someone who had some knowledge of that period and suggested that that wharf was built there because there was actually some sort of obstruction to navigation, which is actually consistent with what I've seen from research, would suggest that that actually was a piece of land that sort of stuck out there and wrapped around. There's a little cove behind it. And in the 19th century, apparently, based on another map, it was called French Fort Point. That was as far as the land went on the west side at that time, and that was the site of Fort Frederick and several fortifications before. So, if you're looking at the maps, you saw these there. So, this sort of illustrates it. I know it's a long way off. I can show you afterward kind of where this is positioned. But you can see down there in the lower left corner, just as the bridge turns, you can see here the forest products, I'm using the forest products term, extending out there on the right. And it's just at that turn. That is essentially what the footprint of the fort would have been at that time, based on everything that we've been able to put together so far, just as the river turns into the harbor. So again, this lends itself to the explanation that what they were defending was the mouth of the river. And Fort Howard did not exist before. Yeah. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about what was around it. There wasn't a great deal here. Portland Point at that time, where our lovely Fort Latour sits now, and where Fort Latour actually sat sometime before this, 17th century. By the mid to late 18th century, Fort Latour had become a busy hub of commerce. You may remember the history of Simons, Hazen, and White, and if you don't, those are all names as a St. John you would recognize. We have Hazen Point School, we have the parish of Simons, and a variety of other things. Those names are three of the six partners who Brigade of an enterprise at Morgan Point. They were New Englanders who came up here to create businesses, to trade, and to supply the states, to supply the lower colonies. By this point in history, this is kind of integral to our story today, they were actually supplying the British Army in Boston, which would be sufficient motivation to create all sorts of havoc here. There was also a small community called Conway, and that occupied a big tract of land, but the community would have been what we know as the Lower West Side, but essentially it was only a handful of families. There was not a great deal else there. So you had Portland Point, there was no Fort Howard. You had Fort Frederick, which by this time had only a handful of soldiers. Most of the garrison having been pulled out. The last of them most likely pulled out and sent to Boston because of the problems that was going on in the 13 colonies. And ultimately, as I say, a handful of families living in the Lower West Side. Even by 1783, when the Royalists arrived, and by that time Fort Howe was there with a full garrison. And even including that, there were said to be, or thought to be, about 400 people in the entire area when the Royalists began arriving. So, not a lot happening, but some of the events or things that were happening here were sufficient to arouse the interest of our former friends to the south. And that brought about the events and activities that are the core of our story today. So hopefully with that, you've got a bit of a sense of the circumstances and the locale, hopefully the significance of what else we have to talk about today. So I'm going to turn things over to Peter and ask him to take you back to the summer of 1775.
All right, and I'll give you a little some detailed background excuse me, on reports, specifically on Frederick. On that picture up there, you can see there's also a monument. And the monument is from the area of the shot is right down here. There. That's Stephen Square over on the west side. And the monument is right here on the corner. So if you're coming off the Harbour Bridge, you're going to be coming along here. And as you drive past here, you might notice it. It is just a rock with a plaque on it. In English and French, it's an official Parks Canada location. And if you're looking it up, you won't find it by the name Fort Frederick. You actually have to look for Fort Charnisay National Historic Site of Canada. Interesting. But anyway, and it just gives a real quick brief, description. It ends with built Moncton, General Moncton, Colonel at the time, built Fort Frederick on the site, and that fort, largely abandoned in 1768, was burned by American privateers in 1775. So it wasn't really largely abandoned, just most of it. Again, back to that, so this is what we're talking about. That's the actual full-size print of a picture of the painting that was done by Lieutenant Thomas Davies in 1758. They had just started to actually rebuild it. I'm not even sure that it was finished being reconstructed at the time the painting was done. The timing seems awfully tight. Because this looks like a very summary picture, but really it was just kind of fancy. Because they had just finished beating up the French. There's a few burned huts and so on. You can see some up on the hill there. They don't look particularly important to me, but they're up on the hill there. I'm sorry it's so far away. Gee, that's almost as far away as the port. Anyway, like perspective guys. So here's some of the basics. The original fort, usually referred to as billable, by 1650, the fort had become the administrative center for the area. 1672, the fort was repaired again because it had gone into disrepair by the Sieur de Montaigne, which is where we get the name Martin, and renamed after himself. Why not? Most people did. This fort also fell into disrepair, and in 1699 to 1700, Villevaux actually arrived as the governor of Acadia and built a new fort on this site and named it Fort Saint Jean, river, of course, and it fell into ruin as well. In 1749, the French troops then built Fort Minnebush on the site of those ruins. With the expected arrival in July 1755 of British troops, the French pulled out and left Fort Minnebush. And they then damaged the fort and tried to render it useless, and were reasonably successful with that. And just as a footnote, Fort Latour, of course, was across the river. It had been taken in 1645 by his arch rival, and then it was rebuilt by Latour, which came back and had taken over the Acadia as the governor. The English and the French, or sorry, the English and the New Englanders arrived and captured Fort Latour in 1654, and it fell out of use, and was later abandoned and was thought to have been actually destroyed either in the very 17th century or very early 1700s and the 18th century. So, Minnebush was a 4-star point, a 4-point star fort, and so this area here, up here, this part would be facing the Route 1 going east, right? So if you were driving across there, you'd be coming from this direction from the city side going west. So sometimes referred to as Carlton Point in some early documents, but not at the time. It was finally the French did rebuild it, and as a 62-meter square compound with 3 barracks for troops, a bakery, and a powder magazine. In 1754, it was reported to have only 17 men and 3 guns. For the French troops, it got a little worrying as Robert Monckton was coming down in this direction from, by the way, he was coming down to his job was to clear out the French. So he arrived with 2,000 British regulars and then Worms Rangers, the Ganks Rangers, and also the Lions. They were there to ferry the Acadians and then moved up the St. John River and into the valley as part of the St. John River. This was really the last bit of the great upheaval for the Acadians, and some were still here, actually, even though the British had taken over. Others had fled and gone much further north or into the interior or even to eastern Brunswick. Although a lot of that migration that was still in Brunswick, those who didn't get expelled, they didn't really start moving until the arrival of the British. So you had places like Baptouche, which was actually settled by Acadians in 1783. They had come basically from much, much further west, even St. Anne's area, and had decided they were getting out because they were settled on land the British was giving away, even the planters who had come from New England, mostly Massachusetts, they also were having a problem hanging on to their original land rights. Anyway, so in, yes? It was the French troops that burned their own fort, because they knew they couldn't defend it. 2,000 plus coming at them, and there were about 17 or 20 men. They just crazy but not stupid. So they spiked the cannons too, and or blew up gunpowder they couldn't take. They just and made a general mess and burned what they could burn. They really couldn't take down, all the earth parts of it, but they did as much damage as they could, and it made it pretty useless. But the British came up with a plan, and they came up with a plan of building a new port. Once the oil was hit, yes. Yep. I know, it's strange. That's a whole other story. I don't really get into it, but you kind of noticed that. And it's true, the planters originally had land grants. The land grants were given to individuals. I'll mention them in a minute. So, don't ask me your question, I think that answer. So the new Fort Frederick was built on foundations of Fort Frederick, except that they made it a 5-foot fort, because they added a forward basket. So that forward basket with the pointing kind of up the hill, when you're coming off the Harbour Ridge and heading to the west side, and you've got to go up that long slope. It was much steeper then. But that's where the outer buildings were. There were plans for extra huts and things like that, because they knew they couldn't put an entire unit or a whole company comfortably inside Fort Frederick, so they had plans to build other buildings, and there might have been a few of those, and just about everybody in any of those forts always complained that fresh water was hard to come. So there were plans to dig a well somewhere further inland, but I don't know if that ever happened, and I can't find out if it ever did. There's just not a lot of information. So the fort was armed with only 18 guns. They planned on 30. They only had 18. And remember, they had a fort pointing in 5 different directions, right? Because there was this serious possibility of people coming in over ground, coming from the west side. There was also the possibility of ships coming up to the St. John River and laying offside in the Nova Sea. And you even had to kind of protect yourself from what we would now call the southern part of the lower west side. Anyway, so in 1768, everything went kind of nuts when we had the little problem in Boston, and I'll mention that in 3 minutes. But basically the fort was totally unmanned by the end of 1768. So in 1764, James Simons put on behalf of his partners, and he had a number of partners at that point, he put in to the British government in Halifax for permission to establish a business in the north end of the harbour of the mouth of the St. John River. Sometimes it was called St. John Harbour, sometimes it wasn't. And then, surprisingly, they did use the name Manifest frequently, or some variation on that. Even the people who lived in the area tended to use that name more so than the official names. So he received his grant. License is hereby granted to Canadian Simons to occupy a tract or point of land on the north side of St. John's River opposite Fort Frederick, but carrying on a fishery and for burning limestone. The said tract or point of land containing by estimated 10 acres, signed by the governor in Halifax in 1764. So he got this permission in 1764 to establish the business officially. So they did. Then in 1765, remember, in 1763, the 7 years of war had come to an end. It's a little confusing. It has a number of names around the world, but usually collectively called 7 Years War, which in this part of the world was actually 9 years long. It's not that they couldn't do the math in Europe, but you know, it was, anyway. It's often known over this side of the world as the French and Indian War, at least solely by the British. That little war was started by some wonky colonial colonel named George Washington. Anyway, he almost literally started that war. That's another story. Anyway, so in 1765, the British government had promised land to officers who had served in that war. So they needed to do something, so they started going through the colonies and finding places where they could, you know, put people. And so 5 townships were actually created in what we now think of as Brunswick, which by then was the county of Sunbury, Nova Scotia. So there were 5 communities, and they were all referred to as townships, great tracts of land. They were given to specific people. There was the township of Conway, Gage, Burton, Sunbury, and Newtown. Altogether, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 400,000 acres were just free to give. But Simons and his partners, his brother, Richard, and James White, actually got one of the grants. But it actually was not one of those townships. It was more important point. That grant grows and grows and grows. And we all remember Parish of Simons. Many of us do anyway, when it amalgamated with St. John in 1967. Parish of Simons was part of Simons territory. It went all the way from our side of Courtney Bay, all the way around north of Portland Point, and covered most of what we understand to be the North Bay. And they had applied for another 150,000 acres. By then it was like 60,000. And by then they applied for about another 150,000 acres in early 1783, and then everything went because the British were saying, well, no, we've got people we're going to have to deal with from coming to this part of the world. So, in 1767, those boys established trading boats in that little community called St. Anne's, which eventually became Frederick, trading with the indigenous folks there. And they traded for furs, not surprisingly. They also traded with the planters who were up there and started to come into the river and settle down and so on. Planters were almost all Massachusetts, not exclusively. They were from all over New England, basically. So furs and produce were often brought down the River St. John, usually by gondola. The boys built gondolas. They worked actually with the Brigade to actually build boats that would go up and down the river. And they also had some small sailboats, and indeed they were building that kind of stuff. So, they would bring the stuff down in the winter on the St. John River. And interestingly, there are two or three references to that happening, and two of them make reference to the fact that we could really only do that in January and February, because the ice wasn't secure enough until January, and by March it was getting thin. And we think the winters were probably worse then than they are now, but and they might have been a little worse. I'm not sure they were as cold. So anyway, so they traded, and the guys they brought in all kinds of things. Let me just go back a minute. And they did bring in things from Massachusetts for trading, and so up the river went stuff like knives, and hatchets, and flour, and pork, and molasses, and stroud, which is a very thick blue material which you make clothing, winter clothing out of, and blankets, guns, and all the things related to that. So guns, powder, flints, and the actual bullets, shot, and of course, rum, either made in New England or made in the West Indies. At Portland Point, their business began to grow quickly. So, by the time we're looking at 1774, 1775, these guys have a number of things going. They were, if you remember the original document said to do lime burning, so lime was being sent to Massachusetts. They at one point had 4 lime kilns. One of them was at the foot of the house, just about where the marigold stuff is, out there somewhere. It's probably been chopped up a little bit, but it's about somewhere about there. That was where one of them was. Another one was out near Lily Lake, and they also had a mill out there, a grist mill. They also did sawing of lumber, and that kind of stuff. They had cooperage, and they had 3 coopers. Just all they were doing was building barrels, because they needed barrels to ship the lime in, and sometimes fish, because they were catching all kinds of different fish, and salting those, and sending them those down to selling those there. And the other end, by the way, are Hazen and Jarvis. They're still in Massachusetts and still doing business up until the war starts. The American Revolutionary War, that is. So they've also got, at least at one point, they've got 2 shipwrights building ships, small schooners that they can use, because they themselves need ships. They either own or charter 17 ships. Most of them sloops, some of them schooners, but they'd be all relatively the same size. And they probably, at one point, maybe, this is a debatable, I would say somewhere between 8 and maybe even as many as 12 ships were owned by partners. So in 1769, actually, kind of interestingly, do that. In 1769, some of you will probably know the story of Thomas Wood, who arrived. He was a Church of England missionary. He was a clever man. He was actually trained in physique, which means he was a doctor, and a surgeon, and then became a Church of England clergyman and was a missionary, and asked actually to work out of Nova Scotia. And so he was based in Annapolis Royal for a while, so he would come over to Portland Point to do services. And some of those services, he had big numbers. People would actually hear about coming, and would come down the river and join him at some of these services. He did baptisms, and he spoke. He could speak and preach, which is a little bit different than speaking, I think. But anyway, he's translation became our church became on the prayer. So, but in 18, this is my favorite one. In 1771, Lord William Campbell arrived. He's visiting Sudbury. He was a Royal Navy officer, colonial administrator, who served as the governor of Nova Scotia from 1766 until 1773, when he died. But he was here in 1771. He came to visit. And he looked at Fort Frederick and said, oh my goodness, and wrote, since Fort Frederick at the entrance of St. John's River has been dismantled and the garrison, formerly consistent of an officer's command, reduced to a corporal and 4 privates. He has had frequent complaints of the Indians on the river. Nobody there. He policing the river anymore. An officer's command could be anything from half a company, so 25 men, maybe under a lieutenant, to maybe even a captain with a full company of 50 men. But it's not even a sergeant, it's a corporal, and 4 soldiers. They wouldn't call them privates, but 4 soldiers. And so he's kind of a little worried. Somebody must have done something because the troops do come back. But the problem was in 1768, the fort was empty. Before we get there, this is just a map to show you the different communities we're mostly concerned with what's down here in the corner. This is Wolastoq. This is the township of Conway. You'll please note that is Musquat Harbor there, and how far it goes, and it's the entire west side, and all the way up past Brandy Point, almost to the Narrowbus, so basically including Grand Bay. That's the township. The map reports Conway had 12 soldiers, but I think that's just in the lower part, down near the north. Because those folks were mostly fishers. They were fishing. And they were catching fish, which would be sold across the river to Broken Point or to Wolastoq. But up in the sub-branch that was Brandy Point, there were estimated to be at least 30 people living there. Now, when it says 12 souls, remember, we're probably only counting men. So it could be 24 or 36. Because we know by 1775 there are 70 people living in the township of Conway. Now, where all of them were, I don't know. Some were living up on Madwagonish Road. Some were living down the far end of, out towards Hartford Island, in that direction. Some were living along the shore down here on the west side, and some were living on the river going up like through Grand Bay West. So that's the community of Conway in 1775. This is in 1768. Everything starts to fall apart for the British government because 1768 is the Liberty riot. That's the Liberty was a truth, and it had been seized because of not paying their new taxes, things that were really upsetting the colonials. The Townsend Act, sometimes they're referred to as the Fowler Act. I'd like to see that more briefly, but technically they were the Townsend Act. So the city of Boston just started going crazy. So the British had to put troops in. And so they put troops in by hauling as many troops in. A good way for troops to come from Europe. They had Halifax had to get as many people together to send to the colonies, specifically to Massachusetts, as they could. And in so doing, they left Fort Frederick empty. And this is an extraction from a letter James Simons wrote in 1768. I believe it was actually to his brother. The troops are withdrawn from all the outposts in the province and sent to Boston to quell the mob. The charge of Fort Frederick is committed to me, which I accepted to prevent another person being appointed who would be a traitor. I don't know, but I must reside in the garrison. But the privilege of fisheries on that side of the river and the use of the king's boats will be more than equivalent for that inconvenience. So he was happy to take the job, I guess. I don't know if he got paid or not. And we don't know, the British left the civilian in command of the port. They may have designated Simons as the barrack master. It would have been unusual for a barrack master who was responsible for barracks to be a non-military person. That did happen in a number of places and occasions. But we just don't know. We don't know if he actually got that document. I've never been able to find anything, British or otherwise, to tell me one way or the other. But anyway, it doesn't really matter. But by 1771, remember, then comes the visit of the governor of Nova Scotia, and he notices that there's 5 men assigned to the fort. So I'm thinking by then, more troops have arrived. Maybe they sent some of those original troops that they had sent to Massachusetts back again, and I can't find regimental numbers or anything like that. People just didn't think necessarily cut that stuff. So, but anyway. So by the summer of 1775, there's now only a corporal and 2 privates. At the time of the raid, and I'm thinking that they're the only 3. And there's a couple reasons for that, but the other 2 may have maybe their muster was finished, maybe they got reassigned to somewhere else in the province or with other troops or something. But corporal and 2 soldiers are on duty in 1775. And in June of that summer, again, the war has just started, is the Battle of Machias, which is listed as the first American naval battle, and where they actually win. It's just a couple of ships. Commander was Jeremiah O'Brien, who was from Maine, which of course, remember, at the time, Maine was actually part of Massachusetts. Maine doesn't become a state until Massachusetts finally gives it permission after some squabbling, and they become a state in 1820. So Maine is actually part of it. It's a little confusing sometimes, but remember, we're talking about people primarily from Maine that are going to do what we're about to see. So Jeremiah O'Brien was probably the cleverest of all their sea captains, especially when it came to naval engagements. And once he had, just after the Battle of Machias, he captures a small British naval ship. So in retaliation, Britain sends 2 ships from Halifax to get him, and he and Benjamin Foster, who I believe was his son-in-law actually, captured both those British vessels in the Bay. So things are just not working out well. That's in July. So along comes August and the raid on Fort Frederick. So into the harbor at the mouth of St. John River, Wolastoq, sailed a privateer, authorized by the state, because they're now calling themselves a state, as opposed to the colony of Massachusetts Bay or Massachusetts Bay Colony. They're now calling themselves a state of Massachusetts. They have elected a Congress, a state Congress, and they have decided, they've heard that there is a ship headed from Boston, and the British are still holding Boston. We've already had the famous battle, but they're holding Boston, and they hear that there's a ship has been contracted to go up to the mouth of the St. John and get supplies. So that information goes to Machias, Maine, goes to Machias, and their Committee of Safety starts the ball rolling. So on that morning or that day, 27 August, it was a Sunday, a ship whose name I cannot find, flying the flag, we don't know, but it's long before there's any kind of a national flag being flown by the Continental Line or any of the official United Colonies congresses. So it's most likely one of the two that we see on the screen. Probably the one on the right. That was a red ensign, and that was traditionally had been used for quite a number of years, many decades, used by New England, especially Massachusetts Bay Colony ships. They used the red ensign with the English flag in it, and then they added the Liberty Tree to that, and in about 1768. And so it was becoming sort of the norm for all ships, although that upper left canton might have actually been the appeal to having the flag up there in that corner. Who knows? But it's flying some flag of recognition. Sails into the harbor, and we have the raid, led by Captain Stephen Smith, commissioned by the Machias Committee of Safety, commanding a 4-gun American privateer from Machias, accompanied by 40 militiamen. It's not the 4 cannon that are the problem, it's the 40 militiamen. How many in the fort? Corporal? 2 privates, 2 soldiers. I would have actually just said, unlabeled, but they had a problem. Their wives and children were with them. And I assume that's why they didn't skedaddle, which is really a 19th century word, but okay. Anyway, so Smith seized the ship and raided the port, burning parts of it and taking port supplies. The ship captured was the Loyal Britain, a brigade team carrying supplies intended for the British forces in Boston. The Britain was already loaded. In fact, when they sailed into the harbor, it was just starting to weigh anchor. It was just starting to pull up the anchor and get ready to leave. So they were just getting ready to weigh anchor, and just in the process of that when the privateer came in. The Britain was loaded with cattle, sheep, hogs, and salmon, butter, a lot of butter, evidently, enough to be about the 4th or 5th item on the whole list. And other provisions that the British Army in Boston could use. The raid resulted in not only the capture of the ship, but also its crew, including Captain Frederick Sterling, who was taken prisoner, also the corporal, the 2 privates, their 2 women folk, and their total of 5 children. They were all taken prisoner. Some of the guys on board the Lady Britain switched sides right there and joined the privateer. Others refused. Actually, the pilot actually joined too. I assume the pilots seemed to actually work for Simons, Hazens, Whites, those guys. Or at least lived in the area and could pilot it into the crazy St. John Harbor. Still make pilots. So those people were all taken prisoners. The prisoners were later released in Boston and returned to St. John, or at least back into British hands. Nobody was harmed or harassed. Of course, they also probably escaped right out of it in Portland Point. So Portland Point was actually okay. So the raid on Frederick marked a turning point in the escalation, and so Captain Henry Mowat, commanding a small British naval squadron, was tasked with punishing rebellious colonial towns So he leaves Boston Harbor on October 6th, and with his ships, including a bomb vessel. They fire mortars as opposed to cannons. They would only get small cannons for personal self-defense, close in quarter stuff. But they can fire mortars, which, like the old cartoons, you have a fuse on it, you light it, you put it in the mortar, you fire it up, and the masters are usually well versed in how bomb catches work and so on. So his orders are very broad, just discretionate, using targets, but go for it. So he looks around and he decides he's going to attack Falmouth. Now, there's lots of Falmouths, but this Falmouth is the Falmouth in what is now Maine. Falmouth, Maine is now Portland, Maine. Confused yet? See what I can do with it. So by October 16th, he arrives. His fleet is anchored off Falmouth. He gives the town ultimatum: you need to surrender or get out of the port. Or out of the town. I'm going to fight. And so by 9 a.m., he's ready to go on the 16th. He's been there for a few days now. And the deadline passes. He looks around, he can't see, it looks like it's deserted. So he raises a red flag, which is the signal for all the ships, and they start unleashing the torrents of firepower. Cannonballs, carcasses were big balls that can be fired by the mortars with 4 fuses on them. They're called carcasses because it was like all explosive and the incendiary inside was kind of held together, kind of the idea that, like in the human body, ribs, and thus you get up the name carcasses. Anyway, they were basically incendiary cannonballs. Bombs, live shells, grape shot, even musket balls. He's firing everything at them. And it's estimated by the American side, the assault lasted about 9 hours, during which approximately 3,000 projectiles were fired at little old Falmouth. Only 3,000 people in the town. So it was a serious attack. And if that wasn't bad enough, the militia, there was nothing they were going to do. They were so busy just trying to rescue people and get them out of the way. So that happens, and off they go. And by the evening, the town's engulfed in flames, and over 400 buildings are damaged and destroyed. 1,000 people are homeless, and forcing them to. They end up living in tents for the winter. So the war continues, the retaliation and the conflict continues. Washington gets very upset because he ends up, what he does is he appoints 2 captains to go intercept 2 ships on their way. He's got intelligence that there are 2 ships that left Britain. They're taking supplies back. He wants that, and there's a reason for that. He will tell you that in a minute. So he sends these 2 guys out to get these ships. If they had done so, they probably would have been beaten. They didn't know that these 2 ships were being escorted by a huge ship. Anyway, so they end up deciding to raid other places. So they raid Charlottetown, they raid Canso, they take prisoners, they take everybody they can get their hands on, especially hunting loyalists, and when they get back, they get chewed up royally by Washington, because he did not want that to happen. He wanted the whole thing to just go for these 2 ships, leave everybody else alone, because he wanted to be able to convince our friends, who were most people up here were supportive of the revolution, by the way. The planters here, folks in Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and he just wanted to leave them alone so we can convince them to join us without shooting at them. I think it was Colonel Allen from Massachusetts, that was from Maine, said, if you want to make enemies, go shoot your friends. Anyway,
All right.
that takes us down to December the 5th.
All right, we will wrap this up fairly quickly. So, Peter's taking you to late in the fall of 1775. Giving you a lot of depth in terms of what was here and some of the things that moved through what was going on. All I want to do is to, I guess, carry this forward on this basis because, as I say, it's our hope we're going to find other events and activities, not necessarily just like this, but we can continue to talk to people about what happened during the American Revolution here, and in the broader sense in Canada. There is probably a general lack of knowledge just about how much Canada was involved. So I can tell you that, to foreshadow a little bit, that the attacks on what we now know as Canada will continue. As these events were wrapping up, the Americans were already moving north to try and seize Quebec and Montreal. They actually succeeded in taking Montreal. They laid siege to Quebec City. That involved our old friend Benedict Arnold, who was 250 years ago right now, having a very miserable time trying to drag his troops, about 1,100 of them, when he started out through northern Maine with bad maps and terrible weather. They would eventually siege Quebec unsuccessfully. About a year from now, troops would, again, coming out primarily out of Massachusetts, but with some of the rebel sympathizers from what we now know as the Brunswick alongside, would lay siege to Fort Cumberland, which we now know as Fort Beausejour, which is just about on the border of modern-day Brunswick and Nova Scotia. The coastal raids, like this one, would continue all around the Maritimes. And there are more local stories to tell. The raiders will be back the next spring, and we're looking at finding a way to tell that story. And then, in a couple of years' time, the ultimate event that would occur here was the St. John River expedition. And we are planning toward telling that story in a variety of ways, and we'll try to keep you all informed about that. But I'll just leave that there as a bit of a teaser for now. So over the next 2 years, I hope to keep your eyes open for us and for other ways that we find and others that we might involve to tell some of these stories. We hope you'll stay tuned, and I will simply close by saying this. If you have an interest in knowing what else is coming up, we do have a Facebook group. If you search Delancey's Brigade Historical Reenactors, you will find us there, and we're trying to keep a fair bit of information there on some of these activities. And so with that, I want to thank you for your patience in listening to us. And if you have any questions, I know we don't have a lot of time left, but if you have any questions, we would certainly, either in this setting or individually, be happy to answer them. The other thing we may have noticed on the way in the door, if you didn't, you may want to take a look on the way out, is we're very fortunate to have someone reach out to us as we started down this path and let us know that they had an actual rendering of the harbour that was done in 1761, and it's the only illustration that we found that actually shows Fort Frederick in situ when it existed. So when that drawing was done, Fort Frederick was there, and we have that plan in this back door. So again, thank you for coming. Any questions, we'd be happy to answer them, and as I say, either in this venue or seek us out individually, we'll be around for you. Thank you.
And there are plans afoot. Generally, I think this is safe to say that O'Leary's is behind it, or in with it, a plan to do an afternoon at O'Leary's to discuss the importance of taverns in the 18th century. You think you know social media now?
Not yet. Okay. Not proposed. That will be on our Facebook page.
Yeah.
Yeah. All yours. Thank you very much.
I have a quick question, maybe, I hope we get a quick answer, because we have 15 minutes. Is it because the French built that other fort, which became Fort Frederick, on the other side of the harbor, and was called Fort Charnesay?
Yes.
Is that why, was it who was the guy in the 19th century?
Alney?
Yeah, no, but who was the 19th century local historian who insisted that Fort Latour was on the west side of the harbor? And
Was that Lawrence? Was that Lawrence? I don't think it was Raymond.
anyway, they battled over for 40 years.
Yeah.
It's a very old story.
Yeah. Raymond seems to have known that it was on the other side of the river.
Hannock.
But I think it was Lawrence.
It was Hannock.
Hey?
Hannock.
Oh, that's it.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
It's a side issue. But
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Any other questions? Really?
45 minutes.
All right, well, before you folks take off for the rest of the day, our speaker next month will be talking about basically the origins of why this was called Nova Scotia. He talks about the early Scots that came from the New World.
Yeah.
60.
I have a digital copy of the map. Wolastoq, River St. John, New Tribe. All written following the river.
Yeah, so hope to see you next month.
Cool. Thanks, folks.
Luke says until next time.
I